Thank you for joining us as we present an introduction to the Emergency Watershed Protection Program of the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. The damage to a watershed from a natural disaster can be devastating to individuals and communities. Erosion, debris, and flooding issues, if not addressed, can further threaten people and their property. Through the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, referred to as the EWP Program, the Natural Resources Conservation Service may be able to provide assistance with protection from additional flooding or soil erosion. Natural occurrences which may lead to EWP assistance include floods, fires, windstorms, ice storms, hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanic actions, slides, drought, and other similar events. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce you to the basics of the EWP program by going through the requirements and the overall process of the program. Before we dive into the mechanics of the EWP program, here are a couple of terms you are going to hear throughout the presentation. First are the terms emergency measures, emergency practices, and EWP work. These terms will be used somewhat interchangeably and generally mean the same thing from a high-level standpoint. These terms originate from different sources like the EWP law or NRCS standards. But what we are talking about are the things the EWP program can do. Second are the terms associated with assistance and funding. NRCS provides assistance in the form of NRCS services and project funding. NRCS services can include things such as staff time of agency experts and utilizing NRCS tools and resources. Funding assistance is also provided for work necessary to complete EWP projects. So, when we talk about EWP assistance, that assistance could be NRCS staff time, federally contracted work, or funding provided to a sponsor to carry out technical work or construction. We will discuss funding later in this presentation, but please keep in mind that EWP assistance means both technical services and project funding. Let's first look at the source of the EWP program. The program originates through a series of laws and is codified in the United States Code. The law is written as follows. The Secretary of Agriculture is authorized to undertake emergency watershed protection measures, including the purchase of floodplain easements for runoff retardation and soil erosion prevention, in cooperation with landowners and land users, as the Secretary deems necessary to safeguard lives and property from floods, drought, the products of erosion on any watershed whenever fire, flood, or any other natural occurrence is causing or has caused a sudden impairment of that watershed. There is a lot of conditions in that one sentence, and we will unpack the program authority over the course of this presentation. But by looking at this authority, we see that the heart of the EWP program is the prevention of additional flooding and soil erosion. This means that all EWP work must address flooding and erosion. We also see that a natural occurrence and watershed impairment must come before EWP work can be carried out. Administratively, the EWP program is authorized in 50 states, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands and American Samoa. As the program name implies, a watershed emergency is required to initiate assistance. The EWP program may provide technical and financial assistance when a federal emergency is declared by the President, or when a local watershed emergency is declared by an NRCS state conservationist. When areas become safe to access after a natural event, NRCS staff may work with emergency management agencies and other partners to identify EWP opportunities. Specifically, NRCS would be looking for opportunities to address flooding and erosion concerns. The EWP program provides funds for measures that remove public health and safety threats and for the restoration of the natural environment after disasters. The conservation practices NRCS regularly uses to address flooding and erosion can be used to provide EWP assistance. The EWP program and FEMA's Public Assistance Program sometimes work in response to the same major disaster events. In the 2018 Memorandum of Understanding between NRCS and FEMA, both agencies committed to establishing an interagency coordination and operation plan for improving coordination. The ICO plan was approved in 2020 and establishes disaster response incident operations. In the ICO plan, the determination for equitable funding authority was highlighted. For NRCS to have authority for an emergency measure, NRCS must determine yes for all these questions to have EWP program authority. Are the measures for runoff, retardation, and soil erosion prevention? Has NRCS deemed the measures necessary to safeguard lives and property from floods, drought, and the products of erosion? Has fire, flood, or any other natural occurrence caused a sudden impairment of that watershed? Therefore, the determination of NRCS authority resides with NRCS, and NRCS does not have a way to make determinations on what emergency work could have been eligible for EWP program assistance. Let's look deeper at what is considered a watershed emergency in context of the program. A watershed emergency means that a natural occurrence has caused a watershed impairment. There are adverse impacts, and there is an imminent threat to life or property. Again, example natural occurrences include floods, fires, storms, and similar events. Within a watershed emergency, NRCS must identify a watershed impairment. A watershed impairment means that the ability of the watershed to carry out its natural functions is reduced. Next, an imminent threat means that significant damage to property or threats to human life may occur in the near future. Another way to think of imminent threat is by saying, if something isn't done, it's going to get worse soon. Finally, property, as in the property being threatened, is defined as structures permanently affixed to the land, such as houses, buildings, roads, utilities, and other infrastructure. Standing timber, orchards, and agronomic crops are not considered property eligible for protection in the EWP program. If the threat is only to cropland, then it is not eligible for EWP program assistance. However, USDA has other programs to provide emergency assistance for agricultural lands, such as the Environmental Quality Incentive Program and the Emergency Conservation Program. When the NRCS state conservationist has enough information to declare that a watershed impairment exists, NRCS may be able to provide a sponsored technical and financial assistance. Additionally, if a floodplain easement is selected by NRCS as the preferred alternative, financial assistance may be provided directly to a landowner. Sponsors must be a state or political subdivision, a qualified Indian tribe or tribal organization, or a unit of local government. All sponsors must have a legal interest in or responsibility for the areas threatened by a watershed emergency. The EWP program requires that sponsors have the following responsibilities, and these responsibilities will be documented in a formal agreement between NRCS and the sponsor. Sponsors must contribute their share of the project cost as determined by NRCS in the form of cash or in-kind services. Sponsors must obtain real property rights, water rights, and regulatory permits, and sponsors must agree to provide for any required operation and maintenance of the completed emergency measures. Also, sponsors must document they have insufficient resources to provide adequate relief from applicable hazards. Sponsors must submit a formal request for assistance to the NRCS state conservationists within 60 days of the disaster occurrence or 60 days from when access to the sites became available. A template letter has been developed for sponsors to use when formally requesting assistance. Using the template will ensure all the program requirements are addressed in the request. Your NRCS points of contact will be able to assist with a formal request when the sponsor is ready. There are a few ways to contact NRCS about the EWP program, but it is best to start local with the district conservationist. You can find contact information for your nearest NRCS Service Center and district conservationist on the NRCS Service Center locator. Each NRCS state office has an EWP Program Manager. EWP Program Managers oversee and coordinate program efforts in each state. Contact information for your state's EWP Program Manager can be found on the National EWP Program webpage. Also, NRCS state conservationists have the implementation responsibilities for EWP program. You can find contact information for your state conservationist in the NRCS State Offices directory. Let's assume there was a disaster that caused a watershed impairment, and a sponsor has formally requested EWP assistance. Later, we will look at what the EWP program can do to provide assistance when we describe the EWP program workflow. But first, let's discuss what EWP program can't do. The EWP program regulations place limits on EWP assistance, and we will go through those limitations now. The first limitation is that the same structural practices are limited to 2 installations within a 10-year period. So if a structure fails twice, the only EWP solution remaining is the purchase of a floodplain easement. The next limitation is that EWP assistance will not be used to perform operation or maintenance, such as the periodic work that is necessary to maintain a structure as originally designed. A sponsor may be asked to provide existing operation and maintenance plans to ensure the EWP work is not in fact routine maintenance. The next limitation is that EWP assistance will not be used to repair, rebuild, or maintain private or public transportation facilities, utilities, or similar facilities. A common question is if EWP can repair a damaged road. The answer is that EWP cannot repair a road, but EWP may be able to provide protection of remaining and repaired roads. The next limitation is that NRCS funded EWP assistance will not be provided for work on any federal lands if such assistance is found to augment the appropriations of another federal agency. For federal lands, the Federal Land Management Agency is responsible for securing funding to undertake emergency repair activities within lands under its control. The next limitation is that EWP assistance is not available for repair or rehabilitation of non-structural management practices, such as conservation tillage and other similar practices. This is a clarifying limit to focus EWP on threats to property or human life. The next limitation is that EWP assistance is not provided to repair coastal erosion to beaches, dunes, and shorelines, including those along the Great Lakes. Remember, the W in EWP stands for watershed. And finally, EWP assistance is not available if the recovery measures are eligible for assistance under the Emergency Conservation Program administered by the Farm Services Agency. EWP differs from ECP because a sponsor is required for EWP recovery work, where ECP can directly work with producers. NRCS may authorize EWP assistance for modifying damaged practices when technology advances or construction techniques warrant modifications. This includes when modifications are needed for federal permitting, and these modifications will be cost shared. If the sponsor desires to increase the level of protection that would be provided by the EWP practice, the sponsor will be responsible for paying 100% of the cost of the upgrade or additional work. Now that we've gone through the limits of the EWP program, let's discuss that NRCS will only provide assistance for EWP measures that meet the following 4 conditions. These are every time, all the time conditions. All measures must provide protection from additional flooding or soil erosion. All measures must reduce threats to life or property from a watershed impairment. All measures must restore the hydraulic capacity to the natural environment to the maximum extent practical. All measures must be economically and environmentally defensible and technically sound. Also, there are a couple of very important program regulations that affect how the EWP program operates. First, remember that the EWP statute said that work must be done in cooperation. This means that both NRCS and the sponsor must agree on all emergency work. A sponsor may determine that specific EWP work is not appropriate, or NRCS may determine that specific EWP work is not appropriate. The EWP program regulations say that NRCS may determine that a measure is not eligible for any reason. This emphasizes that both NRCS and the sponsor have to green light all proposed EWP work prior to construction. And second, NRCS will not provide funding for activities undertaken by a sponsor prior to the signing of an agreement between NRCS and the sponsor. Let's expand on the defensibility requirement that applies to all EWP work. While developing proposals for EWP work, NRCS will consider the following criteria. The EWP work is more beneficial than adverse in environmental and economic effects. The EWP work follows federal, state, and local laws. The EWP work is acceptable to affected individuals and communities. The EWP work is effective in restoring or protecting the natural resources. The EWP work is complete with all necessary components included. And finally, the EWP work is efficient in achieving the desired outcome. NRCS must ensure that quality work is being installed by the EWP program. All engineering work performed by NRCS or for NRCS must conform to the requirements of the NRCS National Engineering Manual. The quality criteria for EWP work are in NRCS Conservation Practice Standards and Specifications, and those criteria are found in your state's Field Office Technical Guide. Your NRCS point of contact will assist you with accessing these resources. So let's recap how NRCS determines what EWP can and cannot do. First is that the program has several limitations that direct how NRCS may use the program. Examples include that EWP cannot be used for routine maintenance, and EWP cannot be used to rebuild a road. Second is that all work done through EWP must meet the 4 eligibility criteria. Examples include that all work must be environmentally defensible and technically sound. As mentioned previously, protection from flooding and erosion is at the center of the EWP program. Therefore, all EWP work must directly address flooding or erosion. Now let's get back to the EWP program workflow. Let's assume there was a disaster that caused a watershed impairment, and a sponsor has formally requested EWP assistance. What are the next steps to making funds available to address the emergency situation? Informal discussions and site visits between NRCS and a potential sponsor can occur at any time. However, once a formal request is received, NRCS will investigate the situation. NRCS will determine if EWP assistance is applicable. Next, the NRCS state conservationist will complete a damage survey report, known as a DSR, which lists the proposed EWP practices and estimates the amount of funds needed. The DSR will be completed no later than 60 days from the receipt of the sponsor's formal request. We will review the DSR contents later in this presentation. Then, if the national EWP funds are available and DSR meets the program's requirements, a notice will be provided to the NRCS state conservationist that says funds are available and may be used for the proposed EWP practices. This means that NRCS can provide financial assistance toward the implementation of the emergency work. Finally, if EWP funds are insufficient or otherwise not available, the DSR will be placed on a wait list. Waitlisted DSRs will be funded according to the funding priorities as funds become available. When the program is operating with a wait list, NRCS will provide EWP assistance based on the following order. Exigency situations. Exigency situations will be explained on the next slide. Sites where there is a serious but not immediate threat to human life. Sites where buildings, utilities, or other important infrastructure are threatened. Other funding priorities established by the Chief of NRCS. Exigency situations are the top funding priority for the EWP program. Exigency means those situations that demand immediate action to avoid potential loss of life or property. These are situations where a second event may occur and could compound the impairment and cause new damages. Actions to remedy these situations must be taken immediately. NRCS may approve assistance for temporary fixes to relieve an exigency situation until a more permanent solution can be designed and implemented. Because of the high-risk exigency, EWP work is required to have construction completed within 10 days of funding. Now back to the workflow. Once a sponsor has made a formal request for assistance, the NRCS state conservationist has 60 days to complete the DSR and will establish a team to evaluate the sites and complete environmental evaluations. Project sponsors may provide information or be invited to contribute staff to the DSR team. Expertise recommended for the team should include the following disciplines: personnel with EWP experience, engineering, resource conservation and planning, economics, biology, cultural resources and historic properties, agreements and contracting, other disciplines as needed. The DSR will document the required information and determinations. NRCS will record program applicability, practice eligibility, funding priorities, and cost estimates for recovery measures. At least one DSR per formal sponsor request must be completed by NRCS. The NRCS state conservationist is responsible for completing the DSR and must be completed within 60 days. Here is a summary of the information needed on the DSR. The DSR contains information about the disaster and the sponsor. The DSR confirms program eligibility by documenting the watershed impairment and that there are no programmatic limitations to assistance. The DSR documents practice eligibility by showing that the work provides protection from additional flooding or soil erosion, reduces threats, restores the hydraulic capacity, and is defensible and technically sound. The DSR contains site information and the associated risks. The DSR includes cost estimates for the emergency practices and the benefits provided. The Environmental Evaluation Worksheet, known as Form NRCS CPA 52, is the part of the NRCS planning process that inventories the potential effects on the human environment to resource problems. The CPA 52 was designed to assist with compliance requirements for federal laws, regulations, executive orders, and NRCS planning policy. All emergency measures documented in a DSR must include a complete CPA 52. A DSR may be supported by one or more CPA 52s, depending on the complexity of the work being proposed in the DSR. The CPA 52 identifies items requiring additional action. These actions must be resolved prior to construction of the emergency measures. For example, the CPA 52 could identify that EWP work may affect a federally endangered species. In that case, NRCS must complete consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service prior to construction of the EWP work. The EWP Program Regulations require that NRCS must minimize environmental impacts associated with the construction of emergency measures, giving special attention to protecting cultural resources and wildlife habitat. When planning emergency recovery practices, NRCS will emphasize measures that are the most economical and can be accomplished by using the least damaging practical alternative by retaining as much of the existing characteristics of the landscape and habitat as possible. Environmental considerations may include altering the timing of the construction to avoid wildlife impacts, use of bioengineering techniques, and revegetating disturbed areas. Now let's get back to the EWP workflow and discuss EWP funding assistance. Recall that a damage survey report included a construction cost estimate for the EWP work. Funds within NRCS are then allocated for the EWP project, and now NRCS can use those funds for EWP implementation. Two types of funds are allocated to an EWP project. Financial assistance funds are used for the NRCS contribution toward construction costs. This can include work performed to mitigate adverse impacts caused by the EWP practice. Technical assistance funds are used for planning, design, contract administration, and construction inspection of emergencies measures. With the funds allocated and available, NRCS can now enter into a formal agreement with the sponsor that details everyone's responsibilities and cost share. The formal agreement between the sponsor and NRCS will spell out who is responsible for what activities, and it will document if and how funding will be provided to a sponsor. The formal agreement lists who is responsible for construction, and this is mutually decided between NRCS and the sponsor. If the agreement calls for the sponsor to be responsible for construction, then FA funds are provided to the sponsor according to the terms of the agreement. Or, NRCS may use FA funds for a federal contract if NRCS is responsible for construction. TA funds may be used for NRCS expenses administering EWP measures, such as staff time or contracted support. Or TA funds may be provided to pay for the technical services the sponsor has formally agreed to complete. After a DSR is completed and funds are allocated for an EWP measure, construction must be completed within 220 days. Remember, the E in EWP stands for emergency, so prompt action is required. In exigency situations, which are the top priority for funding, construction must be completed within 10 days after the funds are made available. By program regulation, the NRCS contribution for EWP construction may not exceed 75%. This means that if NRCS provides 75% of the construction costs, then the sponsor would be responsible for 25% of the construction costs. The exception for the normal cost share rate is if an area qualifies as a limited resource area. In this case, the NRCS contribution may not exceed 90% of the construction costs, and the sponsor would be responsible for 10% of construction costs. Limited resource area have specific criteria in the EWP regulations. You can find a map of the limited resource area counties on the National EWP Program webpage. Sponsors must contribute their share of the construction costs by providing funds or services necessary to undertake the activity. The sponsor's cost share rate is determined by NRCS and ultimately documented in the formal agreement. Contributions that may be applied toward the sponsor's cost share of construction costs include cash or in-kind services such as labor, equipment, design, surveys, contract administration, construction inspection, and other services. The type, quantity, and value of the in-kind services must be approved by the NRCS state conservationist, or a combination of cash and in-kind services may be approved. Sponsors are responsible for the following costs without NRCS assistance, and these costs do not contribute to the sponsor's construction cost share. These costs include costs associated with obtaining any necessary property rights, water rights, and regulatory permits. Costs necessary to provide operation and maintenance of the completed emergency measures. And all services not considered in kind as determined by the NRCS state conservationist. Please know that sponsors cannot use funds received from a federal grant as their matching share for EWP recovery measures. The need for an operation and maintenance agreement will be determined by the NRCS state conservationists on non-federal lands. When the EWP work is installed on federal land, the federal agency administering the federal land is responsible for operating and maintaining emergency measures. O&M is a prerequisite for EWP assistance when the emergency measure needs to be operated and maintained in order to serve its intended purpose, or the emergency measure needs to be operated and maintained to ensure that it will not become hazardous. A separate O&M agreement is developed according to the terms of the formal agreement, and the O&M agreement will identify the sponsor's O&M requirements. O&M begins when the measure is installed and extends until the emergency measure has served its purpose. O&M activities must be performed in a manner that will protect the environment and otherwise comply with NRCS, state, and local requirements. And finally, the method of performing O&M is at the option of the sponsor. Let's do one last recap of the information in this presentation. The EWP program provides protection from flooding and soil erosion when necessary to safeguard lives and property when a natural occurrence causes a watershed impairment. To formally start the EWP workflow, sponsors, who must be a unit of government, may request EWP assistance, and they maintain several responsibilities through the process of planning, designing, constructing, and maintaining the EWP work. NRCS will complete a damage survey report that contains proposed EWP practices and cost estimates. NRCS must follow program requirements, limitations, and practice eligibility criteria when providing financial assistance. The sponsor and NRCS will enter a formal agreement that details responsibilities and cost share requirements. The agreement will document if and how funding will be provided to a sponsor based on the sponsor's role in planning, design, and construction. Thank you for your interest in this presentation, and if you have additional questions about the EWP program, please feel free to reach out to your state and local EWP points of contact.